Okay, I think we'll kick off and let other people arrive in due course. So thank you all for joining us again for another edition of our weekly calls. So for anyone that hasn't joined before, these are an opportunity for practitioners from across the world to get together and exchange notes and ideas on how the industry is working through the crisis. We're really excited about today's guest, which I'll move on to in just a moment. But before doing that, I'd like to give a very quick update on what we've been up to over the past 7 days before moving on to our speaker for today. So thank you all for joining us at a slightly later time today. The reason for that is that we just wrapped up day 2 of our virtual international summit, which was our kind of first fully fledged virtual conference. We had more than 200 people take part, 40 speakers from across the world sharing best practice advice on how communications professionals can deliver value at these times. So it was a really brilliant session, and we've had some great feedback from all the attendees already. Yesterday, you may have caught the announcement that at the beginning of the summit, David Gallagher, who's the president of Omnicom Public Relations Group, was announced as the chair of our new Global Ethics Council. So that's a group of around 20 PR professionals from all across the world who've signed up to a new committee of ours, which aims to effectively establish and elevate ethical principles of public relations practice across the world. We're all very much aware of how important ethical conduct is now more than ever, and we're really pleased with the caliber of people that we've got lined up on the council. So do keep an eye on that for more information. The other thing that we've been working on this week, so our global COVID-19 communications task force has been steaming ahead with delivering support and resources to practitioners to help them through this crisis. The latest piece of work they've done was the delivery of a new task force forum. It was a live session delivered in partnership with Deloitte. We had Mark Hutchin, who's the reputation lead for Deloitte here in the UK, and also an economist, Maximilian Baumgart, who joined him to give a kind of broad overview of where the economic land lies, and kind of looking at economic issues from a PR and comms angle. It was a really fascinating overview. It's free, it's open to anyone. I will pop the link into that. I'll pop the link to that chat and to all the task force work in the chat form here. So do feel free to check it out and let us know your thoughts. Okay, so that's pretty much it for activity for this week. Today, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Whitney Dailey, who's the Vice President of Marketing Research and Insights at Novelli. So Whitney's based in Boston, Massachusetts in the US. And for more than 8 years, she's led the development of the agency's award-winning research. And she's going to be speaking about some of that research in just a moment. Whitney holds an MBA in Environmental Management and Entrepreneurship from the University of Massachusetts and a BA in Business Administration from the George Washington University. She is a guest lecturer at Harvard University, Boston College, Boston University, and Simmons College, and was recently shortlisted for the 2019 PR News Platform Awards PR Professional of the Year. So we're very grateful for Whitney for taking the time to join us today. And if I could just ask everyone on the group, I think everyone's muted already, but just do ensure that your microphones are muted while Whitney's speaking, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So thanks very much. And Whitney, it's over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for having me after what seems like a very busy 2 days for PRCA. So appreciate you making the time and opening up a new time slot for this. I'm very excited to be with you all today and be able to share some of the research and insights that we have been working on for many months now. And I think, like many on the phone, Porter Novelli had a research topic in mind for 2020, and we were plugging away on that, and we had to hit the brakes really quickly and pivot to obviously something that was much more top of mind for our clients and the globe. So I'll be sharing a little bit about our COVID-19 tracker today. And just a little background about the tracker. I'm sure that everybody on the phone has probably heard the word unprecedented more in the past 3 or 4 months than they have in their lives to date. But I think it's an accurate way to describe our current situation, and certainly from a PR and communications perspective, there has never been a moment, certainly in 3 or 4 or more generations, where we have seen every single individual, every organization, nonprofit, government agency affected in the way that coronavirus has affected all of us. And because of that, there's no game plan, there's no playbook for how to act or what to do, certainly for the decisions that we make as individuals, but also the decisions that we make as organizations. So that is why Porter & Novelli really thought to create this tracker. Porter & Novelli has producing primary research on consumer expectations of responsible brands for about 3 decades, but there's certainly no benchmark for what we're experiencing now. So we thought to create that benchmark through producing this research on a bi-weekly basis. And that really allows us to not only benchmark trends that we're seeing as we evolve through this crisis, but also allows us to open up new opportunities to ask different questions as the crisis evolves. What are the new expectations that consumers are having? What are stakeholders asking for? What does it mean to go back to work? What new issues should companies be focusing on? How do we communicate? All those questions are things that we hope to dig in through the tracker. So today I'm going to focus primarily on our US data. We do have UK data as well, and we'll be releasing an Australian tracker actually in the future. So keep watching Porter & Novelli's social channels and you can see those subsequent reports come out. I am excited to announce that we will be releasing the 4th wave of our US tracker today in the marketplace. So you can go to our porternovelli.com website later today and be able to see that. So with that, I'm just going to dive in. So certainly this is an all hands on deck situation, right? We need government, we need nonprofits, we need educational systems, we need religious organizations to all be working to address coronavirus, put forward solutions, and provide relief efforts. What we wanted to understand through this tracker was the corporate perspective in this. What do individuals ask from companies? What are the expectations? How should companies be acting, specifically when it comes to things like employees and other stakeholders? So the first few data points that I will share today, I think are actually some of the most important. And this is the role of companies in this new ecosystem that we find ourselves in. So more than 1/3 of Americans actually have more faith in business to solve the coronavirus pandemic than other entities, including government and nonprofits. And nearly half believe that companies can actually create these solutions better or faster than government. So I think this really speaks to the role that Americans are setting for companies to be solution providers, not just throwing money at a philanthropic effort or giving to a nonprofit, but driving solutions. So Americans see the ingenuity of business, the scale, the speed, the acumen to really be a major solution provider and a major player in the current crisis and how we hope to solve it moving forward. And that shift has actually impacted consumer perceptions of business overall and what they expect from business moving forward after we get out of this crisis. I'm sure many of you on the phone are familiar with Milton Friedman, the famous economist who decreed that business's role in society is to make money for shareholders. That is certainly no longer the case. We, of course, have been tracking this evolution for many years, and I think coronavirus has actually caused this role to shift even further. So nearly 7 in 10 Americans say moving forward after the pandemic, companies should prioritize the needs of all stakeholders, not just shareholders. And Americans kind of see this as a watershed moment for how companies should act moving forward. In fact, 71% say that they believe the pandemic will force companies to act more responsibly in the long term. So again, we're seeing this evolution based on our current crisis. It's really shifting the expectations and the role of business in society. And that's actually having an impact on overall corporate reputation. So 2/3 of Americans have a better opinion of business overall because how they have stepped up during the pandemic. And further, what we're seeing is that this is having an impact on individual reputation of companies. And certainly what we're seeing is that Americans are watching the good and the bad actions of companies right now. 3/4 say they'll remember which companies stepped up to provide coronavirus support. And 71% say they'll also remember the bad decisions that companies made, and that's going to stay with them. Nearly the same amount say if they learned of a company being irresponsible at this time, they'd stop buying products from that company. So this is really having a long-term reputational impact. The actions companies make today will stick in the minds of Americans far after this pandemic. But it's certainly not all bad reputational news. We asked Americans what sort of actions you're willing to take to support companies that you think are doing a good job providing COVID-19 specific responses. So as you can see here, higher levels of loyalty, trust, more likely to purchase. But even looking at these organizations through the lens of where Americans want to work or invest. So again, reputational impact that's moving into areas like purchase, invest, work. So very far spreading implications for the actions of companies right now. So the next section that I'll move into is how can companies communicate right now? Certainly, we need to be communicating with a high level of sensitivity and an understanding of the emotional elements of this. On top of that, we're also communicating in a very, very crowded space. So how can companies break through with their messaging and resonate in the minds of Americans and consumers overall? So as I said, we've conducted this over multiple waves. What we're seeing is that there's actually an increase in Americans that feel better when they hear about what companies are doing related to coronavirus. So now we're up to 3/4 of Americans saying they feel better when companies publicly announce what they're doing. But at the same time, Americans are getting overwhelmed by the amount of messaging. And certainly we've all seen this. If you turn on the TV, you're listening to the radio, on social media, every single company is out there with a "we're here for you" message. And that's causing a level of kind of apathy in the minds of consumers. But more than that, it's causing an uptick in the amount of consumers that are actually questioning the authenticity of these messages. So since we started conducting this, you can see here, we've seen an incremental rise in the amount of Americans that are really questioning the authenticity of companies' coronavirus support efforts, which I think only heightens this need to communicate authentically. But we actually asked around the specific messages that Americans want to hear from companies so that they can break through in a way that's authentic, giving Americans the information that they're asking for. So when we asked around the specific messages that individuals want to see, you can see here messages of innovation, appreciation for employees, and reminders that companies are there for their customers or their consumers. Those are the messages that are breaking through the most. I want to point out that 56% around innovating products and services. I think this really speaks again to what the role of business is in this equation. This is about innovating. This is about being a solution provider, not just sending out messages of support. And of course, when we look at the different media channels that Americans want to hear this message, here we see media stories really topping the list, followed by social media and advertising. I will point out in our UK wave of this, media was far and away the most important channel that UK citizens wanted to hear company efforts. So I think that speaks to the importance of the role of PR in communicating right now. So I'm going to shift gears once again as we kind of move to the end of the research portion of today's presentation, and just talk a little bit about the complexity that is deciding how to reopen the economy and what that looks like for business and the role and the expectations of Americans towards business. What we're seeing is that more than 2/3 of Americans actually disagree that the pandemic has slowed enough for Americans to go back to work. This number, I will share just as a little sneak preview, has dipped slightly as we go into our wave 4 of this report, but still pretty steady. I think it's around 64%. So a majority of Americans say, no, it's too early to reopen the economy. But when it comes to making that call on when we should reopen and what that looks like, Americans are more likely to trust business to make the right call than federal or state government. So again, we're seeing Americans look to business to really be a leader in determining what the path forward is. And more than that, again, as companies look to determine what that reopening plan is, they really need to look at the guidelines and recommendations of healthcare and science experts over state, local, or federal government. And of course, there are reputational and financial impacts to reopening and what that looks like. Americans really believe that companies are on the line to create safe and healthy workspaces and make decisions that are really in the interest of employees, as you can see on the slide here. And that is going to have financial impact. 2/3 of Americans say they will stop buying from companies that are irresponsible about bringing employees back. Certainly, we've already seen this play out in the news where companies have opened factories and then a day later have to go and shut them again due to an outbreak. So this is happening in real time, and we're seeing the implications around that. And this is really critical to think about what back to work looks like, especially when you consider that more than 1/3 of employees are actually concerned their employer will make them go back to work before they feel ready. In our wave 4 of this tracker, we're actually seeing this number increase even more. So as the reality to come back to work becomes more of a reality, Americans are getting more fearful about what that means for them personally. So as a company, we really need to think about how we can actually co-create solutions with employees to make them feel really comfortable about going back to work. 69% of employees specifically said they want to be part of that decision-making. They want to provide feedback. Nearly the same amount want their company to actually ask them their opinion about what it feels like to go back to work and what would make them be most comfortable. And again, communication is increasingly critical at this time. More than 3/4 of employees want their companies to communicate not only, okay, here's the back to work plan, but this is the planning and the process that we put behind this to create that safe and healthy workspace. In terms of just specific action, so making this a little bit more actionable as opposed to theoretical, what companies can do and what American employees are looking for. Topping the list on what would make them most comfortable, providing PPE, so masks, shields, gloves, screening employees, whether that's through temperature checks or antibody testing, and actually introducing remote working flexibility. Obviously, we would counsel any organization to do their own survey around this and really gauge the expectations of their own employees. We've done the exact same thing at Porter Novelli ourselves to kind of help determine our back to work. So to close this out, I will leave you with 2 data points around the need to really lean in on being a responsible organization right now. In fact, Americans actually feel that more than half of Americans feel purpose-driven companies will fare better during this pandemic and come out of this better on the other side, which I think really speaks to the ingenuity that Americans are seeing when companies lead with values, lead with their purpose, lead with being a responsible organization and a community-first organization. And I'll also point out, for those companies that are leading with purpose, don't stop your other social environmental efforts. In fact, 2/3 of Americans feel that companies need to continue these efforts even during the pandemic. And we've certainly seen this as the crisis evolves even on Monday with the UN announcing 150 signatories to make sure that we're looking at climate as we think about COVID-19 and global reopening strategies. So with that, I will just leave you with one final point and one final insight. I think that this tracker, wave over wave, continues to prove that purpose is really the path forward. Being a responsible, community first, employee first organization is really what we're seeing. And while I don't think a return to full normalcy is even possible at this point, I think that we can take this crisis and emerge on the other side, potentially changed for the better as organizations. So I hope that the data and the insights I shared today are useful for your organization and give you the confidence to act today, but also plan for a brighter and stronger tomorrow. So with that, I will close out this presentation, and I think we're going to open it up to Q&A.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Whitney. That was fascinating. Really appreciate you taking the time to share that data. And I know over 1,000 people took part in that study, so it's really reassuring to have rock solid data to draw on. I think the biggest thing that I picked out from that was the shift in trust from government to businesses, and it's fascinating to see how that's playing out. And it may in part be due to the fact that I think consumers and the public in general are seeing businesses deliver solutions that traditionally governments would have delivered. So, for example, in New York, Mike Bloomberg is delivering the tracing program, and there are other examples of where the private sector is stepping in and delivering value that I think traditionally a government would have delivered. So it's really interesting to see the figures behind that. But I'd just like to get your thoughts on where you think that trend is heading. Do you feel it's been accelerated by this crisis, and do you think that will, in say 5 years' time, how will that shift look like?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's something that we've been watching far before we entered this pandemic. In fact, we started to analyze businesses' role in society, especially in the US, after the 2016 election, and getting an understanding of if government is not going to be the primary stakeholder in creating these policies to protect social and environmental issues, whose role is it? And what we saw is that increasingly Americans felt that business needed to take the lead in the absence of government regulation. And I think certainly since we asked that question in 2017, that has really only accelerated. And there are a number of proof points that we've seen in the marketplace, whether that is BlackRock CEO Larry Fink making the announcement that purpose-driven organizations are actually more financially viable, and the implications of that, or the Business Roundtable announcement from last August, where signatories really redefined the role of business in society and the purpose of business in society. So we were kind of seeing this, and we, of course, we've been tracking it back to 1993, but we've been seeing this evolve over time. But I do think that COVID-19 has kind of acted as a moment in time where consumers are certainly saying business needs to step up even more than ever. And I don't think that will change after we get through this moment of crisis. I think it will only continue to kind of accelerate that conversation and that expectation.
That's interesting. And one of the other points you made was the idea that people felt like that they were being overwhelmed and bombarded with messages. And that's certainly something that I know here in the UK has been a big issue. But at the same time, your data suggests that people need to be kept informed and they need to be made aware of how businesses are responding. So how do you think, as a brand or an organization, how do you strike that balance between saying what you need to say but not overwhelming your stakeholders?
Yeah, and that has certainly been, I think, a major challenge for most organizations in this environment. The space is increasingly crowded. We're hearing the same messages from all sorts of organizations, yet at the same time, companies need to communicate what they're doing. It's important information to get out, not only for consumers, but certainly for employees as well. So what we've seen, there are two things I think that I would point out as advice. One is for companies to really look at communicating impact. So it actually, in our wave 4 of the tracker, this is something that we unpacked even more. I think we're at the point in this crisis where some company release efforts have been happening for weeks and even months. So what are the numbers that we can share that kind of show that impact and really show how this specific effort is causing a positive benefit? So whether that's sharing the stories of the individuals that have been positively impacted, or the numbers and the data behind it, I think that's one way to really break through in a really crowded space right now. The other way is to look at how you can leverage your partners. What we found is that 54% of Americans actually feel a company's announcement is more authentic if they hear about it from a third party. So if you're working with a nonprofit, if you're working with local or regional government to kind of get your initiative off the ground, see if you can lean on those partners a little bit to share your message as well. And that helps it break through, that helps it become more authentic in the eyes of stakeholders, I think.
Yeah, and that's good news for PR professionals, isn't it? The idea of third-party endorsements is kind of needed now more than ever before. One of the other things you picked up on was that there was a hesitancy amongst employees and a nervousness about returning to work. And I think you said that was on the increase. Is that correct?
Yes.
So we held a task force forum a couple of weeks ago with some PR professionals in Southeast Asia who are kind of further along in the process than we are. And they said the same things. They said that people first and foremost were concerned about the health of their family and themselves, and everything else was second to that. And a lot of the organizations that we spoke to were giving employees the opportunity to kind of take part in staggered returns and to give them as much time as possible to do that, and not necessarily expect them back as soon as the government's regulations change. Do you think that's the right approach, and what advice would you share for others in a similar position?
Yeah, I think so. And certainly what our research is showing is that employees really want to be a part of the planning process. When it comes to reopening and what that looks like, they want to share their personal opinions, they want to share their feelings, they want to know that they're being heard. And I think that this only highlights just what a personal and an individual time this is. Every single individual has a different threshold for what feels comfortable for them. And I think companies need to keep that in mind. Having a blanket approach to back to work, I don't think is going to work right now. It's highly individual, and companies need to understand that individuals are going to want and expect or need different things. I think a lot of organizations, if they are able to slowly bring their employees back to work, I know that's not feasible for every single business, and I want to call that out, especially those that are implementing essential tasks right now. But those that do have the flexibility, to consider more of an opt-in approach to going back to work. That way, employees can kind of choose what's best for them at this time.
Yeah, definitely. I think helping them feel as though they're part of the processes will be crucial, I think.
Yeah.
I'm just conscious that we may have a few questions from people who have joined us. So is there anyone who'd like to ask Whitney a question?
And should I go ahead and unmute? Would that be helpful?
Yes, yeah, if you could.
Okay, yeah. I am unmuting everyone, so please feel free to self-mute yourself.
If not, I'll, one of the other things that you pointed out was obviously the long-term trend of purpose communications, and that's something that we've seen probably over the past 2 to 3 years here. Is it your view that this current crisis will accelerate that trend, and how do you see that playing out over the next few years?
Yeah, I do think it will, and of course, you know, we're not even out of the crisis yet, so it's still hard to predict what will happen moving forward. But I think that this has really been a moment that has caused many individuals to think about the organizations that they want to associate with and support. I mean, certainly on a local level, even in my own neighborhood, it's very clear to me the businesses that are really putting their employees first and protecting them, maybe even at the issue of losing revenue, and those companies that are trying to push forward in unsafe conditions. So even at that level, I am recognizing this is the bakery I want to support moving forward. This is the coffee shop that's doing things right, and I feel good about having it in my community. And I think that even goes up to the biggest corporations right now and the actions. I mean, you can see this even in communications of major companies. Certainly, this is a time where a lot of organizations have had to make really challenging decisions and difficult decisions, but it's all about how you communicate that and how transparent and open and honest you can be about the struggles that companies are facing. So I certainly think that this is a moment where you know, consumers are looking at companies, they're thinking about the company that they keep, and I think that will continue moving forward.
Yeah, there was a really excellent example from Airbnb, wasn't there, recently, about how
right.
an organization can obviously do the best job that it can in really difficult circumstances. For those that aren't familiar, I think the CEO went out of his way really to just communicate every aspect of their approach to redundancies. And they even went as far as kind of publicizing the skills of everyone that they were letting go on their website, which I thought was a really nice touch, and giving all of their employees the best chance to find work in the future. I thought it was a really good lesson for everyone. Sorry, go on.
Oh, just to add on that, we had been kind of tracking that and other leadership announcements as well. So in the wave 4 of the tracker, which is being launched today, we asked a series of questions related to leadership and what individuals want to see from CEOs and business leaders. And what we're seeing is spot on with the Airbnb announcement is that Americans really want leaders to just be open and transparent and speak with authenticity. We found, I think it was in the high 70s of Americans saying, I'd rather hear an open and honest, unscripted message from a CEO than a corporate statement. So a good key takeaway for communicators, this is a time to really kind of think about how we can act with a level of humanity as opposed to a scripted announcement.
Yeah, that's great. It actually kind of leads on to what was going to be my final question, unless we've got anything from anyone else, which was about just thinking more generally about communicating in this era. What's kind of the top tip that you could share for practitioners at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes right back to that. Speak with humanity. This is a global crisis that is having deep and widespread impacts across the world. And every single individual is feeling that. And they want to know that companies care about them as individuals. And I think that is the key takeaway is, remember, at the end of the day, whether you work for a major corporation or you're just one person, it is all about people. And if we can keep that in mind and really focus on the people aspect of this, I think that we can remember really at the end of the day what is most important and be better business people, better communicators because of it.
Great. Thank you very much. I think that pretty much brings us to the end. So all that's left for me to do is just to thank you, Whitney, for that really excellent presentation. Really appreciate you taking the time out from your busy schedule to join us. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to join you all.
And to everyone else, we'll be resuming at our normal time next week of midday UK time. And do keep an eye on your emails. We'll be announcing the guests for that in the coming days. So we hope to see you again next week. And thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for hosting. Have a good one.
No problem, Anna. Thank you. Thanks for your help at the beginning.
Yeah, no worries. I do it on our side all the time. So.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
Yep. Bye.